one, sort of how we think about free trade as economists versus the broader society. And clearly with sort of the trade policies of the most recent or the last administration, where it appeared, obviously, no one sort of listens to economists in terms of promoting free trade. It really got me thinking about how we think about trade policy, particularly not just sort of in ag econ, but economics, and just the language we use. And then here, this is going to be actually a particular case. I'm still sort of in between, should I make this a case study or maybe an AAPP feature. It's not about sort of agricultural trade policy per se, but one of the biggest sort of interventionist policies of the last administration, which was sort of the steel and aluminum tariffs, and the implications for the canned food sector, right, which has been huge. And I didn't realize how big it had been until I actually met the CEO of Bush Beans, and he agreed to actually be a part of the case study if we write it. And one of the first things he said to me, and I know I need to hurry up to make sure I'll stay within 20 minutes, was he said, right now, the cans cost more than the beans, right? This is sort of when we first started talking about all of this. And so it really got me thinking about sort of the implications and why was this tariff so punitive on a sector that used steel, right? Is this, it may be, oh, you know what it is? We have to put it, hit your, because it's trying to move the bottom. So if you could highlight the presentation, like put just, yeah, there we go. And let's see if that's working now. Perfect. All right, so for the most part, we've sort of thought about protection in the context of nationalism, right? And even when you poll consumers, you do get this case where the more educated the consumer, the more they're in favor of trade. Not like economists, obviously. We're in the 90%, whereas society is maybe around 50%. But even with education, you still find it's this sort of support for trade. And education is not necessarily about being in a sector that doesn't face foreign competition, but just simply being exposed in terms globally, whether it's exposed travel to foreign countries. And so the more educated an individual is, the more likely they're sort of open to trade. But for the most part, trade attitudes seem to be guided by this idea of what's good for the country. Not necessarily what's good for the sector, what's good for an individual per se, but what's good sort of for the country and who we perceive to be our fellow man. And it puts trade in this context of open trade leads to sort of winners abroad and losers domestically. Right. And then something that's real key is that this idea that individuals have a very difficult time linking policies to their individual outcomes, right? Whether it's job loss, income loss, but really relating that to policy is particularly hard for individuals. All right, so here's where I think where we sort of kind of first went down this road of winners and losers. And it goes to a quote by Milton Friedman, and we often cite this, right? This idea that sort of free trade is in the general best interest of society, but protection is in sort of the special interest of society. And it sort of highlights this diffused cost but concentrated benefits problem, right? So if you have the benefits being concentrated in a small group, and then the cost of those benefits could then be pushed to society, right? It's much easier then for politicians to implement policies in favor of the concentrated benefits. And then, unfortunately, it makes us sort of think of trade in the context of consumers versus producers. I mean, all economists, we talk about it this way, right? Free trade is good for consumers because it lowers prices, but protectionism is for these domestic producers. But here's the thing that really takes place when it comes to particular policies, and that is there's special interests on both sides. You actually do have concentrated benefits as well as concentrated losses, and it's something that we tend not to think about. All right, and here's some perfect examples. All right, so if you just think about the WTO case against country of origin labeling, that Canada and Mexico raised at the WTO against the United States as it related to country of origin labeling in the beef sector. Like, one could think about consumers versus producers, but both sides of that issue were really companies, right? Cattlemen pitted against processors and other individuals that relied on imported cattle in the United States, not about sort of producers versus consumers. And something that sort of recently came to my attention is something I know, if any of you have ever heard of the Congressional Candy Caucus. I mean, right, I had never heard of them before, but some of you have. And that's a group that actually supports Congress to get rid of sugar policies, right? Because you could think about the sugar industry really wanting access to cheap sugar, right? So in this case, we're really talking about a policy that affects trade, but there are companies and concentrated benefits and concentrated losses on both sides. In this presentation, I'll focus on the Section 232 tariffs and quotas on imported steel and what it meant for the canned food sector in the United States. All right. Just sort of for the sake of time, as I mentioned, a lot of this came from just sort of interactions with the Bush being CEO. But the point to note is in 2018, just due to national security concerns, but really through this Trade Act of 1962 that actually allows the president to intervene and restrict imports in the name of national security. The Commerce Department did a study in 2017 and said that yes, in fact, that steel and aluminum imports are a threat to national security. And then the point is the president then, through these other acts, could then impose a 25% tariff. And the focus of this is what's been the implications for the canned food sector. But then the real question is, how did all of this come about? And it's really based on something that's not true. This idea that we don't produce anything anymore. There's this assumption that manufacturing is in decline in this country. But if you look at even up to the first year of the president's administration, that this slide actually represents the change in manufacturing over the last 2 decades, right? Up by 166%, computer manufacturing up by over 2,000%. So clearly this is a misunderstanding of what it means for manufacturing employment to decline, as well as manufacturing as a share of GDP to decline. It does not necessarily mean that manufacturing has declined. But this is a popular ideology in society now. Somehow we don't produce anything anymore. But this is partly driven by certain sectors that have disappeared, right? And so just to give you a perfect example, when we eliminated what was called a multi-fiber arrangement, sort of a policy in place for nearly 3 decades that restricted textile and clothing imports in the United States. And once we got rid of that, imports surged, and we clearly have seen decline in sectors. Right? But just overall manufacturing is not in decline, but just certain sectors have gone away, and particularly textile and manufacturing. So you get these sort of niche stories where you could point to a shut down factory, right? And then you could point to a town decimated by, say, quote unquote, free trade, but it doesn't necessarily speak to the entire sector. And then obviously you get then sort of slides like this, where you show global steel production, and then you could clearly see sort of when China in global steel production in and of itself surpassed all other countries, right? And so you did have this fear of the rise of China and sort of monopolizing the steel sector globally. All right. But here's the downside, all right? So here's where we're really, what I really want to sort of get to, is that yes, you implement these policies to help the steel sector, but you end up hurting the users of steel in the United States far more than you help, right? The actual steel industry. And in fact, the Peterson Institute just did a study, and they said for every job saved in the steel industry, it actually cost the economy $650,000. And you got to think about that's pretty mind-boggling, right? But here you can see the actual estimated losses relative to the actual jobs saved, right? Through these interventions, both by President Bush as well as by President Trump. All right, so what's important in this case is just a small niche area of the steel sector and that's template production, right? Templated steel. It's not a major area, but it's particularly important for the canned food sector. All right, and technology has really developed it over time. It's the means by which we can actually convert perishable agricultural commodities to a shelf-stable product, sort of not just in the short run, but at least a decade, sometimes 2 decades, right? And you can think of the food security implications there. But so it's fitting that when these tariffs were first put in place, that Secretary Wilbur Ross would use a canned food item as his example to say there's nothing to see here, right? And I don't know if you all remember this on CNN, or I think it may have been MSNBC. It's one of these major news outlets where he held up this can to say that the steel in this can is only 2.6 cents, and if you multiply that by 1.25, you only get a 1 penny increase in the final price. And so the rest of this presentation is going to be about what did he get wrong with that simple analysis, because he clearly got quite a lot wrong in terms of what it would mean for increased costs. All right, so here's the first thing, just the overall price of refined tin. And mind you, some of this is inflationary, and you did see some decline right after the tariffs were in place. But here's the main thing that I want to at least highlight, and that's the price of canned vegetables since the tariffs were put in place. For the most part, relatively stable prices, right, throughout the last decade. And then you see as soon as the tariffs were implemented, we get into this upward trend, then pushed even more so upward by the pandemic and supply chain issues. But the point is, clearly we've seen an increase for producers actually, right, in terms of the retailers that buy canned foods to sell to consumers, increasing more so than the food CPI. But we've also seen a significant decline, 5 minutes. We've also seen a significant decline in canned food production in the United States since the tariffs were implemented. All right, so we get both this run up in prices, a decline in production, and we've even seen in some of these niche categories the significant increase in imports. All right, so you think about the role of this policy, obviously, is to protect the domestic sector, but you protect one domestic sector at the expense, right, of something that's particularly important to the U.S. economy, and that's the canned food sector. And so here's just an example I picked from prepared bean imports, right? So you see, for the most part, relatively stable, but this shaded area represents everything that's taken place from the steel and aluminum tariffs from that point on. 143% increase, right, just in the last couple of years. And this is just a slide showing you, it's a little hard to see some of these declines, but where we buy, this is the largest template category. There's a few of them, but this is the largest. It's just called tin-coated steel. And the places we bought, you could see some of the declines there. Overall, it's only been a slight decline, just relatively speaking, because that industry has grown so much. But here's some things. So what did Wilbur Ross, former Secretary Ross, get wrong? All right, so one is just sort of the emergence of new technologies in this area. Particularly, I'll just highlight one, and that is the movement from sort of 3-piece cans to this more efficient 2-piece can. That requires this highly technological and specific process, the means by which you melt steel and form these cans. And they can range from anything from food cans to paint cans. But here's the thing to note, that these food companies have to actually engage in contracts, right? This isn't a free market to where they could buy this tin-coated steel. And you really do need companies close by to produce cans for 2 reasons. One, obviously, you don't want to transport air. And what's happened as a result of the tariffs is many companies are forced to transport air, right? Because if you got to sort of bring in empty cans, for the most part, what you did is you sort of paid for space, because cans take up a lot of space, but they don't have a lot of content, right? So hence the reasons why you saw some price increases. The other thing is that a lot of these companies engaged in contracts with foreign companies, and clearly to replace those contracts, right, were not as easy, particularly when you add both tariffs as well as quotas. So let's think about some other things. Open trade actually mitigated domestic market all right? But once you restricted imports, you have these sort of regional producers that actually had more market power than before. So not only do they have the sort of added price increase from the tariff, but they then also have the added price increase from the market power that is a result of the restricted trade, right? Then there's limited capacity on the part of the U.S. Like, you can impose tariffs all you want. It doesn't incentivize a company to produce more tin-plated steel. And so now you have this increased competition when you have limited supply, which also drove up prices. And then these companies operate on a necessary margin, right? They're not like farmers that can go through losses and that they need for shareholders. If they promise a 10, 15% margin, they still strive for that, and that gets compounded along the supply chain, right? And so what have we seen is that a classic case is that this 25% tariff has done more than simply, say, the steel share of its price, right? It's increased prices quite dramatically. So I'll close with just a few things, and how much time do I have? 0. All right, so this is just, one could call this slide propaganda, but I'm only highlighting this because this is from a company, a group, and it's called Canned Good, right? Like, not just like canned goods, but good, a play on. But obviously they're trying to lobby Congress to get rid of steel and aluminum tariffs by highlighting what they feel are all the benefits, like steel being fully recyclable, the food security issue in terms of low-income households being some of the major purchasers of canned goods, as well as the means by which to mitigate food loss by preserving food over time. All right, and so I'll close with this one last thing. I think, so now, what is the Biden administration sort of thinking about? Sort of modifying this. If you recall, the Biden administration has not done anything to sort of get rid of the tariffs from the Trump administration, but they're at least sort of thinking about modifying it. The question is, will they make things worse? And that is to sort of modify these steel tariffs to sort of to encourage or to penalize countries whether or not they produce clean steel, right? The environmental regulations associated with it. Clearly, this is all aimed at China as before, but it raises a very important question. And that's really the question for us at the round table, is are we really trading off one social outcome, right? The environmental cleanliness of steel production for another, right? Increase in food waste, lower food security for low-income households, and even obviously the benefits of canned goods for global food security. And that's really the question on the table. But the point is, as I said, I only highlight this as this is one of those classic cases of trade intervention having very little to do with consumers versus producers, but producers versus producers, one being the user of a commodity and the other being the actual producer of that commodity. So with that, thank you, and I look forward to your questions.